Hello Year 6, welcome back to Stormbreaker. We are on chapter 16. 12 o'clock. London appeared. Suddenly the clouds rolled back and the midday sun brought the whole city shining into view. There was Battersea Power Station, standing proud with its 4 great chimneys still intact, even though much of its roof had long ago been eaten away. Behind it, Battersea Park appeared as a square of dense green bushes and trees that were making a last stand, fighting back the urban spread. In the far distance, the Millennium Wheel perched like a fabulous silver coin, balancing effortlessly on its rim. And all around it, London crouched, gas towers and apartment blocks, endless rows of shops and houses, roads, railways and bridges, stretching away on both sides, separated only by the bright silver crack in the landscape that was the River Thames. Alex saw all this with a clenched stomach, looking out through the open door of the aircraft. He'd had 50 minutes to think about what he had to do. 50 minutes while the plane droned over Cornwall and Devon, then Somerset and the Salisbury Plains, before reaching the North Downs and flying on towards Windsor and London. When he had got into the plane, Alex had intended to use its radio to call the police or anyone else who might be listening. But seeing Mr. Gwyn at the controls had changed all that. He remembered how fast the man had been, both outside his bedroom and throwing the knife when Alex was handcuffed to the chair. He knew he was safe enough in the cargo area with Mr. Gwyn strapped into the pilot's seat at the front of the plane, but he didn't dare get any closer. Even with a gun, it would be too dangerous. He had thought of forcing Mr. Gwyn to land the plane at Heathrow. The radio had started squawking the moment they'd entered London airspace and had only stopped when Mr. Gwyn turned it off. But that would never have worked. By the time they'd reached the airport, touched down and coasted to a halt, it would have been far too late. And then, sitting hunched up in the cargo area, Alex had recognised the 2 bundles lying on the floor next to him. They had told him exactly what he had to do. "Arr!" Mr. Gwyn said. He twisted round in his seat, and for the last time Alex saw the hideous smile that the circus knife had torn through his cheeks. "Thanks for the ride," Alex said, and jumped out of the open door. The bundles were parachutes. Alex had checked them out and strapped one onto his back when they were still over Reading. He was glad that he'd spent a day on a parachute training course with the SAS, although this flight had been even worse than the one he'd endured over the Welsh valleys. This time, there was no static line. There was no one to reassure him that this parachute was properly packed. If he could have thought of any other way to reach the Science Museum in the 7 minutes he had left, he would have taken it. There was no other way. He knew that, so he had jumped. And once he was over the threshold, it wasn't so bad. There was a moment of dizzying confusion as the wind hit him once again. He closed his eyes and forced himself to count to 3. Pulled too early and the parachute might snag on the plane's tail. Even so, his hand was clenched and he had barely muttered the word 3 before he was pulling with all his strength. The parachute blossomed open above him and he was jerked back upwards, the harness cutting into his armpits and sides. They had been flying at 4,000 feet. When Alex opened his eyes, he was surprised by his sense of calm. He was dangling in the air underneath a comforting canopy of white silk. He felt as if he wasn't moving at all. Now that he had left the plane, the city seemed even more distant and unreal. It was just him, the sky, and London. He was almost enjoying himself. And then he heard the plane coming back. It was already a couple of kilometres away, but even as he watched, he saw it bank steeply to the right, making a sharp turn. The engines rose and then it levelled out. It was heading straight towards him. Mr. Gwyn wasn't going to let him get away so easily. As the plane drew closer and closer, he could almost see the man's never-ending smile behind the window of the cockpit. Mr. Gwyn intended to steer the plane right into him, to cut him to shreds in mid-air, but Alex had been expecting it. He reached down and took out the Nintendo. This time, there was no game cartridge in it, but while he'd been on the plane, he had taken out Bomber Boy and slid it across the floor. That was where it was now, just behind Mr. Gwyn's seat. He pressed the start button 3 times. Inside the plane, the cartridge exploded, releasing a cloud of acrid yellow smoke. The smoke billowed out through the hold, curling against the windows, trailing out of the open door. Mr. Gwyn vanished, completely surrounded by smoke. The plane wobbled, then plunged down. Alex watched the plane dive. He could imagine Mr. Gwyn blinded, fighting for control. The plane began to twist, slowly at first, then faster and faster. The engines whined. Now it was heading straight for the ground, howling through the sky. Yellow smoke trailed in its wake. At the last minute, Mr. Gwyn managed to bring the nose up again, but it was much too late. The plane smashed into what looked like a deserted piece of dockland near the river and disappeared in a ball of flame. Alex looked at his watch. 3 minutes to 12. He was still 1,000 feet in the air, and unless he landed on the very doorstep of the Science Museum, he wasn't going to make it. Grabbing hold of the cords, using them to steer himself, he tried to work out the fastest way down. Inside the East Hall of the Science Museum, Herod Seil was coming to the end of his speech. The entire chamber had been transformed for the great moment when the Stormbreakers would be brought online. The room was caught between old and new, between stone colonnades and stainless steel floors, between the very latest in high-tech and old curiosities from the Industrial Revolution. A podium had been set up in the centre for Seil, the Prime Minister, the Press Secretary, and the Minister of State for Education. In front of it were 12 rows of chairs for journalists, teachers, invited friends. Alan Blunt was in the front row, as emotionless as ever. Mrs. Jones, dressed in black with a large brooch on her lapel, was next to him. On either side of the hall, television towers had been constructed, with cameras focusing in as Seil spoke. The speech was being broadcast live to schools throughout the country, and it would also be shown on the evening news. The hall was packed with another 200 or 300 people standing on first and second floor galleries, looking down on the podium from all sides. As Seil spoke, tape recorders turned and cameras flashed. Never before had a private individual made so generous a gift to the nation. This was an event, history in the making. It is the Prime Minister, and the Prime Minister alone, who is responsible for what is about to happen, Seil was saying, and I hope that tonight, when he reflects on what has happened today throughout this country, he will remember our days together at school and everything he did at that time. I think tonight the country will know him for the man he is. One thing is sure, this is a day you will never forget. He bowed. There was a scatter of applause. The Prime Minister glanced at his Press Secretary, puzzled. The Press Secretary shrugged with barely concealed rudeness. The Prime Minister took his place in front of the microphone. To be continued.